The rumble of the Harley-Davidson sliced through the heavy air of the dock, thick with tension and failure. The morning sun gleamed off the hull of the world's largest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald Ford, standing still like a mountain of steel. With every minute it remained idle, far from its international mission, the Navy's sense of shame seemed to deepen. Entire teams of engineers had tried, and failed, to understand the collapse in the power system. The pride of the fleet was wounded, and everyone felt the weight of it. Captain Scott watched the sleeping giant with concern. Beside him, Admiral Grant stood motionless, his calm gaze fixed on the ship, the look of a man who hadn't given up yet. Suddenly, the growl of the motorcycle grew louder. A 1970 Harley-Davidson rolled slowly down the pier, drawing every eye around. On the seat, an 84-year-old man with a calm, steady look approached without hurry. Scott raised an eyebrow and muttered, "That's the old man we've been waiting for?" Grant took a deep breath and replied firmly, without taking his eyes off the veteran. "Careful with that tone, Captain. And take it easy, guys. The legend's here." John Carver parked the motorcycle in front of the massive, silent ship, looked up at it and said, "Let's wake him up." John stepped off the motorcycle with the calmness of someone who had faced far worse situations before. Admiral Grant walked toward him with a faint smile, extended his hand and greeted the veteran firmly. "Mr. Carver, thank you for answering my call." "Admiral," John replied, shaking his hand. "Didn't think I'd see this giant again, especially not sitting still." Captain Scott stood a few steps behind, watching the scene with clear suspicion. His eyes scanned the veteran from head to toe, analyzing every detail. When Grant turned to introduce them, Scott stepped forward and extended his hand in a formal but unenthusiastic gesture. "Captain Michael Scott, commanding officer of the USS Gerald Ford." "John Carver," the veteran replied, gripping his hand firmly. Scott forced a polite smile, but his tone carried skepticism. "Mr. Carver, with all due respect, we already have the Navy's top engineering teams working on this issue. Our specialists are trained specifically for the systems on this class of ship." John crossed his arms and tilted his head slightly, as if listening to a child explain something obvious. And yet, the ship's still dead in the water. The comment was simple, direct, and devastating. Scott felt the heat rise up his neck but kept his composure. "It's a complex failure," he said, trying to maintain authority. "Not something you fix that easily." Grant quickly stepped in, sensing the tension building. "Captain, Mr. Carver was part of the development team for the first Ford-class carrier, the USS Enterprise. He knows these ships better than anyone." Scott drew a deep breath, surprised, but unable to hide his frustration. "With all due respect, Admiral, that was a long time ago. The systems have evolved. The new Ford-class generation is far more advanced. The Gerald Ford isn't for amateurs." John looked at the captain for a long moment, letting the word amateurs settle. Then with the same calm tone as before, he said, "Captain, did you check the auxiliary power line and the logs from the last startup attempts?" Scott opened his mouth to reply but hesitated. It made sense, disturbingly so. Grant seized the pause. "Captain, allow Mr. Carver to at least inspect the control room. If he doesn't find anything, we'll go back to your original plan." Grant gestured for them to head toward the access ramp. John started walking, followed by the Admiral and the captain. As they climbed the ramp, John could feel the weight of distrust around him. The engineer's eyes followed him with thinly veiled skepticism. Some whispered among themselves. Others simply shook their heads as if watching the Admiral make a serious mistake. As he passed a group of engineers observing from a distance, one of them, a young man with an incredulous look, muttered to the colleague beside him, "That's the guy? He looks like my grandpa." The comment wasn't loud enough for John to hear, but Scott did. And though he said nothing, he also did nothing to stop the doubt that was beginning to spread through the team. As they entered the first interior corridor, John ran his hand along the metal wall, feeling the cold texture under his fingers. That simple gesture brought back a wave of memories. He remembered the first time he had ever set foot on an aircraft carrier, decades ago. He'd been young, full of energy, and believed that naval engineering was the noblest way to serve his country. "This way," Scott said, pointing to a stairway that led down to the lower levels. They descended in silence. Exposed pipes, control panels, the constant hum of auxiliary systems that were still running. John took in every detail. When they finally reached the main control room, John stopped at the entrance. The space was impressive, filled with cutting-edge technology, a far cry from the analog systems that had been standard when he first joined the Navy. 3 engineers were hunched over a central workbench, analyzing schematics on their tablets. They looked up as the captain entered, confusion crossing their faces when they saw the elderly man accompanying him. "Attention," Scott announced without enthusiasm. "This is John Carver. He's going to observe the system for a few minutes." One of the engineers, a man in his 40s, frowned. "Observe? Captain, with all due respect, we need someone who can fix it." "I know," Scott said tightly, but Admiral Grant ordered him to assess the situation. The engineer backed off, but clearly wasn't happy. John took a few steps around the room, studying the panels. His eyes scanned the projections, but his mind was working on another level. Scott crossed his arms and checked his watch. "Mr. Carver, if there's any specific report you'd like to examine, we can make it available. But I need you to be quick." John didn't respond right away. He kept walking, ran his hand along one of the consoles, and stopped in front of a display showing the ship's nuclear power grid. "Did you test the bypass capacitors?" he asked, without looking away from the screen. The 3 engineers exchanged glances. "We tested everything," the oldest of them said defensively, "twice. The capacitors are working perfectly." John nodded slowly, but he didn't look convinced. "And the voltage regulators on the secondary line?" "Those too," another engineer replied, sounding impatient. "Sir, we've gone through every component of this system. The problem isn't in the individual parts, it's systemic." John finally turned to face them. "Exactly." The silence that followed was heavy. Scott narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean by that?" John walked over to the central workbench and pointed to the holographic diagram floating in the air. "You're looking for a broken piece. But the problem isn't a piece, it's how the pieces talk to each other." One of the engineers let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Talk to each other? Sir, this isn't philosophy. It's engineering." John stayed calm, but there was a sharper light in his eyes. "And that's exactly why you haven't fixed it. You're treating this ship like a machine. But ships like this are living systems. Each part depends on the rhythm of another. And when you force modernization without respecting the original architecture, you create blind spots." Scott stepped forward, irritated. "Mr. Carver, this ship was designed by entire teams of top engineers. Every modification went through years of testing. Are you suggesting they all made mistakes?" John met his eyes directly. "No, I'm saying they weren't there when the heart of this ship was designed. I was." The tension in the room thickened. The engineers looked at one another, unsure. Grant stayed silent, observing. Scott clenched his fists. "So what are you suggesting? That we ignore years of safety protocols and rely on your intuition?" John didn't look away. "I'm suggesting you let me do my job, or you can keep explaining to the Pentagon why the world's biggest aircraft carrier has turned into a floating monument." The hit landed hard. Scott felt the truth in those words. He knew time was running out. He knew every conventional attempt had failed. But the thought of handing control to a man who seemed from another era made him deeply uneasy. Grant finally spoke, his voice low and firm. "Captain Scott, give him full access." Scott turned to the Admiral, stunned. "Admiral, that's—" "An order," Grant finished. Scott took a deep breath, swallowed his frustration, and nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." John turned to the engineers. "I'll need full access to the reboot history, and I want to see the logs from the week before the failure." The engineers hesitated, but after catching the captain's look, they began working. Within minutes, John was leaning over the data, his eyes scanning through lines of code, energy graphs, and event timestamps. Then he stopped. His fingers froze on the console. His eyes narrowed. Scott noticed the change. What is it? John didn't answer immediately. He zoomed in on a specific section of the log, looked again, then cross-referenced it with another data graph. And when he finally lifted his head, there was something new in his expression. "Found it?" he said, a faint smile forming on his face. Scott stepped forward, trying to control the mix of hope and disbelief rising inside him. "Found what, exactly?" John turned the main monitor so everyone could see it. He pointed to a series of sharp spikes in the energy graph. "Here, look at this pattern. Every time you tried to reboot the system, there was a 1-second power surge right before total shutdown." One of the engineers moved closer, studying the data carefully. "Yeah, we saw that. That's why we suspected the capacitors, but every test shows they're working fine." John shook his head. "Because it's not the capacitors, it's the timing. You're dumping too much power too fast into a system that needs a gradual warm-up ramp." Scott frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "The startup protocol was updated specifically to speed the process up. It's more efficient." "More efficient for entirely new systems," John countered. "But the central power structure is still based on the original design. It was built to receive power in progressive waves, not bursts. When you push energy in too quickly, the system reads it as an overload and shuts itself down." The room went silent. The engineers exchanged uneasy looks, processing what he just said. "And you're sure about that?" one of them asked. John looked straight at him. "As sure as I am that I love my bike." Grant stepped forward. "What do you need to fix it?" John turned back to the console and began typing commands with surprising speed for a man his age. The engineers watched, impressed, as he navigated through the ship's systems like someone greeting an old friend. "I need to adjust the startup sequence. I'll add longer intervals between each power-up stage. It'll take more time, but it'll work." One of the engineers hesitated. "Mr. Carver, changing the startup protocol without prior testing could be risky. If something goes wrong, the ship stays dead," John interrupted, not taking his eyes off the screen. "Exactly where it is now." Scott looked to Grant, who gave a silent nod. The captain drew a long breath. "Do it." John kept working. His fingers danced over the keyboard, entering codes, adjusting parameters, rewriting the sequence that had failed dozens of times before. The room was completely still except for the soft hum of auxiliary systems and the quick tapping of keys. Minutes passed. The tension was thick enough to feel. Finally, John stepped back and looked at the main monitor. "Done. The sequence is set. Now we need to try the startup." Scott moved to the main console, placed his hand on the control panel and looked at John. "If this doesn't work, we'll have to start over from scratch, and we're out of time." John met his gaze, steady, confident. "It'll work." Scott pressed the confirmation button. A low beep echoed. The room lights flickered briefly. Every monitor lit up, displaying the real-time startup sequence. Stage 1, auxiliary power online. Stage 2, primary reactor warming up. The low hum of the systems began to grow, a deep, resonant sound rising from the ship's core. Stage 3, gradual power distribution. John watched the graphs closely. The power curves rose slowly, exactly as he'd programmed. No surges, no collapse. Stage 4, main system synchronization. The lights stabilized. The hum became a steady, deep roar, like the heartbeat of a giant coming back to life. Then the main monitor flashed the message no one had seen in days. System operational. All reactors online. The silence broke with a collective gasp. One engineer took a step back, stunned. Another ran a hand through his hair, laughing in disbelief. Scott stared at the monitor, then at John, and for the first time since the veteran's arrival, his expression changed. The skepticism was gone. What replaced it was respect. Grant placed a hand on John's shoulder and smiled. "Welcome back, Mr. Carver." John nodded, saying nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the monitors, watching the steel giant slowly awaken, regaining its strength, its life. Scott approached, extending his hand. This time, the handshake was genuine. "Mr. Carver, I was wrong. Thank you. John accepted the handshake with a faint smile. No need to thank me, Captain. Just doing what I've always done, taking care of my ships. Around them, the engineers got back to work with renewed energy, checking systems, confirming every reading. The room that had been drowning in despair now buzzed with the quiet triumph of a hard-won victory. Scott looked out through the observation window, watching the lights of the USS Gerald Ford come on one by one, like stars waking in the dark, and for the first time in days, he felt the mission was possible again. Moments later, John was back on the pier. The USS Gerald Ford stood majestic before him. But now, it was no longer a motionless mountain. It was a living giant, pulsing with energy, ready to fulfill its mission. Grant and Scott walked toward him. The captain's expression had changed, not just gratitude, but understanding. "Mr. Carver," Scott said sincerely, "I underestimated you, and I owe you an apology." John shook his head slightly. "You did what any commander would do, protect your ship and your crew. There's nothing to apologize for." Grant extended his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Carver. The Navy won't forget what you did today." John gripped his hand firmly, but his eyes stayed on the ship, as if saying a silent goodbye to an old friend. He walked over to his Harley-Davidson, climbed on with his usual calm, and started the engine. The familiar rumble echoed across the dock, now blending with the deep, powerful hum of the USS Gerald Ford. Before leaving, John looked back one last time at the ship. He smiled, gave a small nod to Grant and Scott, and twisted the throttle. The Harley disappeared around the curve of the pier, carrying away the veteran who had done the impossible. Grant and Scott stood quietly for a moment, watching the ship that was finally alive again. "He was right," Scott said, breaking the silence. That afternoon, the USS Gerald Ford left port and headed out on its mission. The waves parted before it, and the horizon stretched endlessly ahead. And somewhere along the coastal highway, an 84-year-old veteran rode his motorcycle, the wind against his face, smiling with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew that, no matter his age, there was still purpose. Because the true measure of a life isn't how long it lasts, but how many times it manages to make a difference when it's needed most. If you enjoyed this story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next.